All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Millennial Sales Podcast. This is your host, Tommy Tahoe Lemo, and we're in it after crazy last few weeks with the election, everything going on. Despite what side of the line that you are on, I think we can all maybe take an exhale that is over. We can move on. We're getting close to holiday season. And truthfully, I'm massively excited to share this episode with you. Got Justin Welsh. So if you are in the SaaS game, if you're on LinkedIn, you probably have seen Justin before, but in case you haven't, Justin is currently the founder of his consulting firm called JW Strategic Advisory. But he really cut his teeth in healthcare, SaaS sales. So he was really kind of a straggler in the beginning of his career, which he's going to get into, in which he kind of jumped around from a few different companies. I think he got fired 3 or 4 times, was struggling to hit quota, ended up finding his place at a company called ZocDoc in 2009, end of 2009, which really turned into a rocket ship. He spent 4 years there, went up from AE to be the director of sales. Eventually wound his way to Patient Pop at the beginning of 2015, spent just about 5 years there, and he was the SVP and CRO there, and he was able to lead them from $0 to $50 million in recurring revenue, and went from 1 sales employee to over 150 sales employees. So over 5 years, they were named, Consumer World Awards Company of the Year, Entrepreneur's 3rd most entrepreneurial company of 2019, one of the fastest growing companies in 2018, best places to work, everything that you would imagine. He helped to lead that organization. And he left that just over a year ago now to start his own consulting firm, which I mentioned, where he's helping to coach other companies get from that 0 to 50 million ARR spot. In the meantime, he has crushed it on LinkedIn specifically, and really is one of the top people in the game around building your personal brand. So he went from virtually nothing to now almost 60,000 followers on LinkedIn. He's got the LinkedIn Playbook that he launched probably a year ago, which is already a 6-figure course. I mean, the thing is, I think it's $50 or $60, and he's earned over 100 grand with it by putting this course together. So it's a very actionable guide for how to build, your content on LinkedIn, how to build a following, and why that's even important in the first place. If you are an SDR or an account executive or a sales manager or whatever you might be, why it's so important to actually build that presence. So we get all over the map. I really hone in with Justin about the early days of his sales career, because I was interested in learning what was that tipping point for him to get from failed sales rep that can never hit quota to all of a sudden this guy that is leading really successful companies and now advising really successful companies. So we do talk about that. We talk about his strategy for networking and how much time that he puts into that. We talk about time management. We talk about money management. We talk about relationship management towards the end, and not with your clients, but with your spouse or significant other. And that's something that I definitely admire him for, is his emphasis that he places on, his wife and spending time with her. And now even having a side venture with her where they founded the Shelby Project, which invests in small companies, not SaaS companies like a barbershop or a, dog grooming company or something like that. That's a small business that he thinks he can add value to. So without further ado, I think you're really going to love Justin Welsh. He's very well spoken. He drops absolute knowledge bombs on a daily basis on LinkedIn, and he's been there and done it. And a lot of things that I want to do in my career, or that you might want to do in your career, he has accomplished them, and he's working on them right now. So I think you're going to appreciate this. The last message before we get into the conversation is, if you find any value in it, if you like what Justin has to say, give him a shout, but show some love to the podcast. Subscribe wherever you're listening, if it's Apple or Spotify, if it's YouTube, what's up? You can check us out visually. This is done on Zoom, and leave a review. That's what helps to spread this message. It's something that I do for free every single week for over 3 years now. and I love doing it. So um, if you could help spread the word, that'd be great. Without further ado, you're sick of hearing me. Let's get into my conversation with the Justin Welsh. Let's go. Justin Welsh, good morning. Welcome to Millennial Sales, man.
Thanks so much for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, how we doing this morning?
Doing great. It's early in the morning and just getting my, what is it, Friday? Getting my Friday started. I've lost track of days since the pandemic. Like, I think I was on a podcast yesterday. I was like, oh, it's a great Monday. And he was like, it's Thursday. I was like, right, makes sense.
And moving across the country probably does that to you and everything too, right? You were on the road for a while, no?
Yeah, we were on the road for, I don't know the exact amount of time, but I think 35 or 36 days. My wife and I left LA in June, I think it was, and we just drove across the country. We drove through Phoenix. We stopped in El Paso, where my wife's parents are from. We did a week in Austin, and then we kind of came through the Southeast and up into Nashville. And I think we've been here now about 10 weeks, and it's been awesome. Like, I love LA, and I miss LA, and I miss all the places that I've lived before. But Nashville has been really cool, super chill, really great people, and so we're just getting used to it. But we love it so far.
That's great. That's great. Well, I want to get into the conversation today. I've found tremendous value in a lot of the content and everything that you've shared on LinkedIn. When you're running Thursday night sales, just a lot of the philosophies that you have. So I'm excited to have this conversation. And I want to take it back to really focus on, at least in the beginning here, on some of the early stages of your career. So there's a post that you had, or maybe several, where you talk about I don't think you hit quota the first 4 sales jobs. You got fired from your first 3 sales jobs, and then you landed at ZocDoc, which happened to be, turned into an amazing company. You had a great run there, and that kind of launched you on a string of really successful tangents in SaaS. But I want to start with those first few jobs. Like, what was going on? Did you really not hit quota? Did you really get fired those 3 times? Like, what was your mentality like? Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, coming out of school, I was always, my dad was a salesperson and he still is, 50 years now, and he spent 40 years at one company. And so when I looked at like my parents, we had, a nice house and a couple of cars, and like we lived in the Midwest. I'm from Cleveland. And so I was like, oh, that's life, right? Like that's what you do, and that's cool and that's awesome. And so I'm going to get into sales and be like my dad. And so I got into pharmaceutical sales, which is what my dad did. And the truth of the matter is, I just wasn't very mature. Um, I was a pretty immature sort of 22, 23-year-old. I guess we all are, but I was probably on the lower end of the maturity level. And so I didn't understand what it took to really be an active and professional employee. And so because I was a field salesperson, which I was for many years, there was no accountability. I didn't have to go to an office. I didn't have a manager looking over my shoulder. And so for the most part, um, I just didn't work very hard. And so when you don't work very hard, uh, physician prescribing habits don't change in your favor when you're selling pharmaceuticals. And so I always missed quota. I got fired from 2 different pharma jobs. And then I ended up in med device. And I ended up in med device as like a step down. I was what they would call a territory associate, making very little money, supporting, a guy who had been at the company for a very long time. And that was like actually my first real look at responsibility, because he needed me to be active every day. And I was in the operating room every morning, generally at 5:30 in the morning. And so I did take pride in that job, and I did land my own territory with that company. But within 10 months, I got fired because I didn't understand the medical device world. I didn't understand how much I had to learn about those products. And I wasn't that interested. Like, I worked a little bit harder and it put a few extra pennies in the CEO's pocket. Like, that wasn't that interesting to me. And so I ended up getting fired from that job at Stryker as well.
So
What did that feel like? Like, were you someone that was, you mentioned maybe you were a little lower on the maturity scale. We all are, I think, coming out of school, or for the most part. But were you bummed? Were you like, man, I think I could be pretty good at this sales thing, or was it just like, hey, this is something I do from 10 to 3, and outside of that, I'm either sleeping or partying or playing video games or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I was bummed, yes. And you'll see me like a lot of times I write on LinkedIn and I say things to the effect of, you control your own destiny and you got to put in the effort and build your network. And what I'm doing is talking to my younger self, talking to people who may have been or may be in the same situation that I was in meaning that when I got fired, I always thought it was someone else's fault. Like that's just where I was in life, right? Like it certainly wasn't me. It was definitely somebody else. And I think if I had been mature enough and objective enough to zoom out and look at the pattern, then I could have very easily come to the conclusion that it was my fault. And so that's why I talk a lot about that stuff, is because I know that there are people in that situation today who are struggling, who have been fired, and who think that it doesn't get any better. And it does. But you just have to objectively look at your career and figure out, like, if things are going poorly, what can I do to improve the situation? So that's why I write about that stuff a lot.
And did that hit you at the time, or is this more so looking back and reflecting?
It's looking back and reflecting.
Yeah.
I got what I would call lucky, and I think anyone whose journey ends up being relatively successful, there is a great bit of luck involved. And I think when people say otherwise, I just don't believe them. I think we all get lucky in some ways.
Mhm.
No, what happened was I put my resume on Monster.com. That was what you did back in 2008 and nine, and it had some relatively exaggerated accomplishments on it, as all resumes do. By the way, I don't recommend that, but like all resumes are exaggerated in my opinion. I've never interviewed a bottom performer, um, and so that resume ended up on the desk of a guy named Cyrus Masumi, who was building a company in New York called ZocDoc. And he reached out to me and asked if I would come to New York to interview. And I was living in Allentown, PA. I had been bouncing around small Midwestern towns up until the age of 28. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'll go to New York City and interview for this job. And what happened, Tom, was there was this really interesting sort of intersection of positive things that happened that set me on the right path. And number one was the product and company was incredible. Like I saw online doctor's appointments that didn't exist in 2009, right? Like, so I was like, oh, this is unique and interesting. This is a game changer. This is something that I would be passionate to sell. The team was like wildly smart. Right? You sit down in a room. I went and interviewed with the four sort of executive team members, and I was like, wow, these people are brilliant. And plus, to the CEO and the COO, and like I have access to these people where I never had that before in my life. The city, the energy of New York City, like you get there and everyone's hustling, and you're like, oh, if I don't hustle here, like you don't survive, right? And then my own maturity level. I was 28, going on 29. And I think it was just the right time for me. And when those four things sort of came together, it just worked for me. And the very first day on that job, I made a sale after having gone like 8 years without hitting quotas or making sales. Like I made a sale my very first job. Like I think his name was Salil Gupta, an orthopedic surgeon. And I still remember it. Like I was with my boss, and I don't know, that like got me really excited. And so for the next 4.5 years, I was got promoted multiple times in that role. I loved it.
Okay, so all right, I love this. So you're 28. You've had this string of unsuccessful sales stints. You find this company, pretty serendipitously. Like you didn't even find it. They found you. It sounds
That's
like,
right.
right? You're energized by the product. You think this leadership is really smart. You make a sale your first day. Things are going well. So at that point, did you change your behavior from what you were doing at some of these other jobs? Did you start working harder? Did you start leveraging some of those really smart people as mentors? Did you start reading books? What was like the action change? What was the tipping point there?
Yeah. First of all, really, really good question. I think yes. So a couple of things happened. For the very first time, I was still a field rep. So I was a field rep at ZocDoc, and I was working a territory to start Staten Island, which was a whole nother story of because I didn't have any car. I didn't have a car or anything. It took me 2.5 hours just to get to my territory. But I had to go to the office at the end of every day. And at the end of every day, if I showed up at 5:30, my boss would be like, "What are you doing here, man? Go back out. Like, don't come back before 6." And I was like, "Oh, this is intense." And so we'd go there, and then we would work until 8, 8:30 or 9, and everyone stayed in the office, and that was like, the thing. And so I had to like work hard, and I was like, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the product. I enjoyed the results I was getting. And back then there were no blogs. Like there was none of this stuff, right? Like you didn't log on and listen to a sales podcast. You didn't read a blog about how to get better at sales. There wasn't a whole lot of technology like Outreach and Sales Loft and Gong and all this stuff. None of that existed, right? And so to me, the way that I invested in myself was through my peers. I was lucky enough to have some really talented salespeople hired around me, some of my best friends to this day. And what we did was we did, bar education. we went out at night, and we argued.
Yeah.
Oh, here's what I would have said to that objection. Oh man, I'm better at sales than you are. Here's how many deals I closed. And it became like that sort of, energetic, alcohol fueled, arguing about sales, but it was cool. Like I was a young person in New York City for the very first time, surrounded by really incredible salespeople. And that was my education, right? And I'm not suggesting that that's the proper way to educate yourself in sales, but that's just what happened to me. And that's my story. So I got really intensely competitive with those guys. And so I wanted to beat them every week. And so yeah, that's how I stayed motivated and got educated.
That's so funny. And that actually gets you more motivated too, because if people are that, interested in sales that they want to have debates about it at the bar and you're kind of going back and forth with people, that's just an inspiring environment. I know when I started, my first sales job was in college selling Cutco knives. And there were these
Sure.
two guys that, we were all doing it for the summer. We didn't know each other before, but we were all very competitive and we would do the same thing. And like each week it would be a competition, kind of like who's going to get the most demos, who's going to sell the most, things like that. And, but not in like a cold blooded way of like, man,
No.
I hope this person fails. It was just like, it just kept me going and it was fun. And it just like gave you something to really get jacked up about in the morning. And so I think early in your career, finding peers, it's great to find mentors and things like that, but finding peers that are also passionate and want to get better is a great kind of tip for getting yourself rolling.
Totally. And like, listen, that kind of education doesn't scale, right? Like you don't, as you get to be 100 and 200 salespeople, that's not how you like train and educate your sales team. But that's just my true story. That's how I got educated in that role. And I think it's really important early on in the startup's lifetime that the first few salespeople that they hire, that they're super competitive and that they don't have to be similar, but they should sort of form a tight bond. And when I go and advise for startups now, and I walk in, or virtually now, of course, but I meet their salespeople, and they're all good buddies, and they're getting along well, and they're competitive. I always see that spark, and I love that. Like I just that's always a good indicator for me that they have at least a good fundamental foundation for selling. And so yeah, that's what happened to me.
And now, how would you recommend folks do that, now in a time where it's all virtual, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm part of a team of got about 10 or so sales reps, right? So it's still fairly young. Like there's some Slack messages, we've got like a Friday happy hour that we do. But other than that, it's very unique joining a company like this. My first time, joining virtually, where you don't have those like moments where it's whatever time, 5 o'clock on a Friday, you look around like, hey, you want to go grab a beer, or like, hey, you want to grab a coffee, or those types of spontaneous interactions don't really happen.
Yeah, I think that's why communities are springing up, right? You see communities for executives like Revenue Collective. You see communities for sales folks like Rev Genius. You see a bunch of those types of communities popping up. And I think like that right now is the closest thing. But I think inside of those communities, you need to form sub communities. So for me, like, yes, I belong to Revenue Collective, and I think there's 2,500 folks in that, and that's awesome. But like, I really have a core group, right, of like 4 or 5 people that I meet with on a regular basis. And so we do Zoom meetings, Zoom coffee, Zoom beer, whatever. I still keep in contact with like a lot of my former colleagues at Patient Pop and at ZocDoc. I have routine, grab a beer on Zoom, like I said. So I think like you have to get creative in that way, but it's really hard when communities are large. And so I always say like find your sub community inside of a community. Find 3 or 4 guys and gals that you really, really, vibe with, and set up something routine and have like an agenda. Like, okay, cool, we're going to meet bi-weekly. Like, what are we going to talk about bi-weekly? Is it just we're going to jump on a Zoom meeting and share a coffee or a beer? That's awesome. It's great for catching up. Or like, are we going to treat this like we might treat a work meeting, right? Where we have like an agenda. Hey, let's work on something together this week. What did you learn? What should we talk about? What's the agenda topic? Is it objection handling? Is it how to work through a multi-stakeholder sales deal? Like, what is the actual agenda? And so I do that with a small group of people that I'm really close with. And we get online, and like Kevin Dorsey, right? KD is a buddy of mine from Patient Pop, and he and I chat every other week. And, we always have like reasons to connect and try and push our careers forward.
That's great. And I think, that also, it speaks to the wisdom of also trying to look outside of your organization for some of that guidance too, because at a company, especially as the company gets bigger, I think there can be groupthink. I think people can start to all kind of have similar ideas, especially if folks have been there for a while. So trying to reach out to folks in different companies or maybe even different industries at different stages, you can get new ideas that way too.
Totally. And I think there's other like creative ways to think about that. For the last week, I've been interviewing coaches, and, I act as an advisor to early stage startups, but I like to have a coach. I have my wife who I can bounce ideas off of. I have my buddies who I can bounce ideas off of, but it's really nice to have sort of an external set of eyes who, has no bias. And so that's what a great coach does. And some really great coaches are really expensive. You can find other folks that will mentor you for free. And so my recommendation, especially in this kind of challenging time of the pandemic, is to go out and find someone who's external to you, to your business, to your core group of friends, to your family, that will be real with you, that will really share, how they're feeling, and kind of not pull any punches. I think that's what I kind of call an accountability partner, and that's, I think, a better name for coach, at least for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I want to kind of fast forward in this story to when you get over to Patient Pop, right? And you have obviously just tremendous success in terms of growing the team growing the revenue from about zero to
Mhm.
$50+ million, several years, growing continuing to expand the team. If you could really point back to anything that you think you did exceptionally well there, that was the difference maker in terms of sales leadership, what do you think that was?
Well, I think first of all, there was another element of luck in this story, and maybe it's not luck. Maybe it's just a really good fit, which is I was a top performer at ZocDoc, and I had moved up the ranks into several leadership roles. And when I went to do my first executive role at Patient Pop as the VP of Sales, it was SMB SaaS in the healthcare technology space, selling to private practice physicians. So it's the same world, right? So I had just been doing that for 5 years, and so I really understood that world. So my first sort of, I guess, recommendation is if you're going to take your first executive role, like wait for the role that feels like it fits. If I had gone into fintech or enterprise selling or something that I just truly didn't understand, I probably would have failed. But I chose something that was right up my alley. So that was the first thing that I think led to some early wins. I think the next thing is like I am, I have a good network on LinkedIn today. Back then I didn't, but I did have a good network of high performers from previous jobs, namely ZocDoc, right? And so when I went out to build my early sales team, like I went on the dating scene, right? Like I went and wooed every person that I could possibly woo to the business to join me. And so for example, like Max Kim Brown was the first salesperson there. He was there before I was there. He's the one who recommended me for the job. He was someone who reported to me at ZocDoc. I went out very quickly and took Derek Jankowski out to dinner and convinced him to leave his job and come join me. And then
Shout
I
out to
went.
Derek.
Yeah, Derek's great. Derek's my first hire, and I had known Derek. He was my SDR at ZocDoc. And so I went out and I started picking off some folks who had left ZocDoc. I have ZocDoc holds a place in my heart, so I didn't steal anyone from the business. I just went out and found those folks that had left and didn't like their jobs, and I picked them from their roles and put them into Patient Pop. And so I think one of the really healthy things that I did was build a good sales team early on, a sales team of proven top performers, folks that I knew would be plug and play, that they weren't risky whatsoever. And that was my strategy as the team grew. My strategy as the team grew, Tom, was to hire less risky people who were much smarter than me in very specific ways and give them autonomy to do their job well. Like, I had never built an inside sales team before, so I hired Kevin. you know Plug and play. He had built Snack Nation. He had built Service Titan. He was, very well regarded. As Max grew his career as a field sales rep, who better than to turn the reins over to him? And he's now the VP of field sales over there. And, what I did was I went and found Robert Palumbo. He was an insanely good salesperson from ZocDoc, and he started to learn how to build partnerships. So as soon as I needed someone to run partnerships, I promoted him into that role. And so, the takeaway is hire people who are really smart and get out of their way. I know that's a popular saying, and that's the one that I followed.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it goes back to the earlier days at ZocDoc, the relationships you built surrounding yourself around great, talented, smart people. And then at what point throughout Patient Pop did you start really leveraging LinkedIn to help grow your network and to grow your brand? Like where like in the time trajectory was that?
Yeah, it was actually like kind of towards the end of my tenure there. I started in January of 2015 at Patient Pop, and I started contributing on LinkedIn in January of 2019. So 4 years later, I had made the hypothesis or like formed one that 2019, 2020, 2021 would be highly dependent on having an audience and a network. And at this point in time, in January of 2019, I had actually had a conversation with the co-founders at Patient Pop and letting them know that I was burning out and that I would be leaving in 2019. And so part of my audience building was, one, I believed it would just benefit me, number one. Number two, I believed it would benefit Patient Pop. I had seen KD doing it for a while, and I could see the benefit that it was having in recruiting. And then, like, the third is, I figured if I was going to leave my job, I better have a really strong network and audience, to leverage. And so I started contributing, I think, in January of 2019, and immediately I kind of joined KD in that journey, and our recruiting jumped like crazy. Like, we had so many inbound folks that were top performers that really helped grow Patient Pop. But obviously, it had benefit for me personally as well, as I left Patient Pop on August 1st of 2019.
That's crazy. I mean, so I want to talk a little bit about the recruiting piece that you just brought up, because that's something that, I've heard Scott Leese talk about as well, that he's never paid for recruiting because of LinkedIn. I think a lot of executives, or some executives maybe, to not paint a broader picture, don't get it. Right? Like they might see that as a distraction, or they might see that as you showing out your ego or something like that, or trying to, flex on social media, or why aren't you selling or doing this forecast or whatever. But there's impacts on, one, the recruiting side, two, the people that you meet, right? That you're then going to have a Zoom coffee with or whatever, help you get better at your job. Right. So there's a lot of, and then three, it adds just general brand awareness. Like I would not know who Patient Pop was without you or Kevin Dorsey. Like I would not know as much about other companies like Drift or Gong or Outreach or whomever if it wasn't for some of the folks that post there. So I think there's just an overall brand reputation. But have you ever had pushback from executives on that?
Yeah, definitely. When I started, it wasn't just pushback from executives; it was pushback from a lot of people. Um, I think the co-CEOs maybe didn't understand, right? They since understand. I'm very close with both Luke and Travis at Patient Pop. They didn't necessarily understand the why behind it, and I think that was partly my fault. I probably didn't do a good job of setting the expectation, which I think if I could go back in time, I would have reset that expectation much in a much better way. And I also think the team didn't understand, right? Like there's a natural inclination, and I did it when I was a rep. I remember doing it at ZocDoc. You don't see the VP a lot. They're in their office, they're traveling, and you're like, does that guy or gal actually do anything? Right? Like that's I remember thinking that like at ZocDoc about some of the folks that we had. Like, oh, is that, they're actually working hard. Yes. So I think that, the team didn't see me that often. I was in my office. I worked from home twice a week. And so then they see me on LinkedIn. Like, I think the natural question becomes like, oh, is this guy just spending all of his time there? I'm very regimented with my time, so I schedule everything that I do. So I think that also caused a very small irritation that I again didn't get ahead of. That was my fault, right? I usually over communicate, and in those two circumstances I under communicated. And so if I could go back in time, I would have communicated more effectively to my team. But I think what happened over the course of time is folks saw the impact. They saw people coming into the business that were better and more talented. They saw that Patient Pop was started to win awards, started to become a recognizable brand. Then guys like Sam Lewis and guys like Jesse Gittler and Derek and started participating and contributing, on the platform. And, we sell websites to physicians. Like there's no reason that Patient Pop should be that popular online, right? There's no indicator that it should be a wildly popular brand. And I like to think that we went from being this sort of hidden brand in Santa Monica to being a business that people wanted to work at. And I don't know, I think that's pretty cool.
Super cool. And you mentioned, this is something I wanted to get into. You mentioned time management. And to me, you seem like someone that from the outside, I don't know you particularly well, but on the outside looks like kind of has like a Tim Ferriss-esque nature to you in the sense that you seem to really optimize things. You seem to really be focused on, not, kind of cutting, trimming the fat, so to speak, in terms of time, in terms of energy, resources, things like that. I know you've, posted before about spending less time, at work even, right? And spending more time with your wife and spending more time, outside or exercising. I know you've lost a lot of weight since you left Patient Pop, all these great things. So walk me through the Justin Welsh day. Like, how do you run your day?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So often when I write content, in fact, the majority of the time when I write content, I'm actually writing to myself. Like it is almost a running, for lack of a better description, like diary or journal, right? And most of the stuff that I'm aiming at is just aimed at myself. And so when I make recommendations, I'm actually reminding myself because frankly, it's something I actually struggle with. So while I can appreciate how it comes across as though I might be in the Tim Ferriss camp, I actually struggle with that a lot. And one thing that I struggle with is I say yes to a lot of things. And so you'll see me writing content about how to say no. I'm telling myself how to say no. And it's something I'm actively working on all the time. And so what happens is I ultimately, because I say yes to a lot of things, I become a workaholic. And so that's something that I'm working on. So I'll give you an example of like a week of mine. I get up every morning around 6 a.m. or 5:30, depends on the day. I carve out time for LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn from 7 in the morning until 8 in the morning, engaging with people, contributing to the platform, having conversations. I do an exercise, shower up. I've got client meetings all day. And then I usually have a podcast or, connecting with Derek or Kevin or Jess Strickland or someone from Patient Pop that, just doing our bi-weekly catch-ups. And that happens routinely, nonstop, Monday through Friday. And then I look back at the week and I say, what happened to the strategic time, right? How do I take my business from where it is today to more scalable, right? And you can't do that if you are continuously a tactician. And so part of what I've been working on over the last 6 months has been removing a lot of those, I don't know how to describe them, but I say yes to a lot of things that aren't as meaningful to me as, strategic work for my business, and trying to really carve out time that is absolutely no time. So like when someone asks to do something on a Monday afternoon or a Friday afternoon, for me, it's no every time. Those are now my strategic times. And so I think you have to be really cognizant because schedules get get crammed up pretty easily. And if you're not aware of that all the time, suddenly you'll look at your week and be like, oh, I don't actually have any time to do something that I wanted to do. And so that's a constant battle for me, to be honest, Tom.
Interesting. And so you've clearly made a priority, though, of continuing to network with people, both on LinkedIn and people, probably net new people, as well as people that you have a relationship, like, say, KD. How often would you say that you're actually having calls with people, whether it's, in either of those two camps? Like, is it every single day you're like, hey, I'm gonna have 3 calls today? Or, like, I know, for example, someone told me before, hey, I want to have 1 networking call a day in the afternoon. That's my goal. Seems like maybe you have more than that. I'm curious, because that's
Yeah.
definitely feel like a strength of yours, is just like the network that you built.
Yeah, it's definitely a strength, and so networking is always time well spent. Don't get me wrong. Like I love to network, and so I usually have I used to have 2 to 3 sort of calls a day, and now I've sort of reduced that to probably 2 calls a week. And so I try and treat it less urgently. I'm huge. Um, one of my challenges is I create a lot of self urgency when there's no need for it. My wife will tell you that. She's like, "There's you don't doesn't have to get done right now. Like you can." That's just how I'm wired. And so I'm starting to space out and spread out how I book calls with folks, so that that thing I described doesn't happen, where my week goes by and suddenly I look back and say, "Wow, I didn't really accomplish much." So I'm now down to about 2 calls a week. And then my clients I work with Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Monday, Friday for me is creative day, kind of like I talked about. I'm usually creative in the morning. I'll write a blog post. I'll write some LinkedIn posts. I'll write just for myself. I like to write. And then in the afternoons, to me, it's strategy time. Like, what am I doing to actually make my business, again, more scalable? Like, what can I outsource? What can I eliminate? I'm thinking about those things Mondays and Fridays. And that has gotten me in a better place. And I plan to accelerate how I spend my time doing more strategic work come, the latter part of 2020 and early 2021.
This might be a strangely tactical question about
Sure.
networking, but sometimes, especially via Zoom, right, as everything's happening nowadays, say you meet someone through Revenue Collective or LinkedIn, and, they ask you for a call, and you're like, hey, yeah, I'll talk to this person. Like, I always find the first, however long, to be like incredibly awkward, because just like, oh, where are you from? How you do? It's like, one person that really stuck out to me, at the first question he asked me was, what are the 3 books that changed your life? Like, before, where do you live? What do you do? That was like his first question. I thought that was super interesting. So I'm just curious if you have any, like, strategic ways you go about networking to get the most out of it, to show your best self, to get the most out of the person you're with, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. Like one guy that I've never met him in person, but we've started meeting on what I would call a semi-regular basis, is a guy named Brendan Short. I met him through LinkedIn, and he's a former founder who had sold his business, and now I think he works for Zoom now. And I don't know, certain people I just vibe with. Like Brendan's a really smart dude. And so when we get on calls, the way that our calls started is by sharing information that we had recently, consumed that was really helpful. Like he's a big information consumer, so am I. I read, I go through blogs, I'm on Twitter a lot, kind of consuming what I think is really good information. And so Brendan and I kind of hit it off just by jumping on the call and being like, hey, did you see this tweet? Did you see how this guy does this particular thing? Did you see how this guy set up his business? And like that just sparked natural conversation versus like, I always do that. Where are you from? Tell me a little bit about yourself, blah, 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 blah. But like, I like to get into immediately talking about, information that we've been consuming, because that opens up broader conversations. What did you think about that? Oh, I liked this part, but I disagree with that part. Why'd you disagree with that part? And then it just becomes a natural flowing conversation. So for me, that's sort of how I think about networking. And in the end, like, I think one of the big things you can do to be a good networker is to say, hey, cool, I had a lot of fun on this call, right? But I have a lot of fun on a lot of calls and we never end up talking, again. Why don't we put a placeholder for next month for, another conversation for 30 minutes? And that way you get some consistency. And I did that with Brendan. I did that with another guy, Kevin Romani. And, we meet on a routine basis now and we have great things to talk about. And it's continual. So our relationship is growing.
Yeah, I love that. And on the train of thought around being interested, consuming, kind of different ideas. Another thing I saw you posting a while ago, and maybe
Mhm.
this was on Twitter, was taking some of the courses that you do, right? Like say the LinkedIn playbook, taking the revenue from that and then like reinvesting that in stocks. And like you seem to have this, again, like the optimized system, it seemed like. So is that something that you, maybe it was just a post and I'm over exaggerating how important it was to you, but is that like can you talk about how you're handling the finances of all these
Totally.
disparate things too?
Totally, man. So that is stuff that I'm very, very rigid about. So I have multiple pieces to my business. So today, the core piece of my business is my advising firm, which is just myself, just a solo guy, and I advise anywhere between 6 on the low end and 10 on the high end businesses at one time, generally closer to 6 or 7, and that is the core, I guess, meat and potatoes of my revenue. Secondarily, I have some additional revenue streams. I have the LinkedIn Playbook, which is a course that I sell, and I think you're familiar with. And so that, in its first 12 months, is a 6-figure course. So that becomes another revenue stream for me. I do coaching. So whether folks want to opt into a coaching package via the LinkedIn Playbook, or whether they reach out to me and they want sales coaching, I'm generally happy to fill up Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday slots that are not available for clients or not taken by clients with coaching. And so that kind of becomes like a third revenue stream for me. My wife and I co-founded a small investment company, which is again just the two of us, called the Shelby Project, and we invest our money into small businesses, like not small businesses like SaaS businesses, like you know plant business, hardware business, flooring business, like helping people get on their feet and get their revenue started. And so we actually make some income through that. And then I'd say lastly, like I get small projects here and there, speaking engagements, and so also affiliate, like I do some small affiliate stuff, sponsorships. Like there's a bunch of different ways that I guess revenue comes in. And the way that I think about it is putting your money to work for you. So I take the money that's core to me through my advising business, and I pay my bills, live my life, and do all the normal things. Anything that's on top of that, I invest. And my goal is to continue to invest as fast as possible in as many different vehicles as possible. And I'm like meticulous at tracking my mint and my wealth front and all that stuff, because I try and scoot that retirement age down by a year every so often. I've got it at 52 right now, and my ultimate
Nice.
goal is like 48. So I'm working towards that, but I'm meticulous about that because it's important to me.
Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned the Shelby Project. I'm glad you did. I think that's so cool. That's like, I don't know if you have ever watched The Prophet, Marcus Lemonis or and anyways, he's just a guy that pretty much does that. He hops into small businesses and helps kind of drive their revenue streams. But what do you look for? Like, can you give me an example of how you've hopped into like a furniture business or a coffee shop or something and actually help them drive revenue? How does that work?
Yeah, we look for proof of at least $2,500 in recurring revenue per month.
Okay.
So, and we also look at any investment needs to lead to very simple revenue streams. So let me give you an example. Um, if you have an idea that has not produced revenue yet, and you come to me and say, "Hey, I could use $5,000 to launch a website, and I don't have that right now to invest in my business," we likely would pass on that because there's not an immediate path to revenue, right? A website doesn't generate revenue automatically. There's no revenue in this company yet. Like it's a risk. Now, if a guy who runs a flooring business, which is a good example, comes and says, "Hey, I'm successful right now. I'm making 3K a month, right? I'm making 36K a year in revenue, but I have some expenses, and I don't have a website, and I don't understand how to market my business. And oh, by the way, I could also use some additional lumber, right? And if I'm pretty busy right now, but I could be twice as busy through a website and some marketing and some new materials, like that person's already making revenue here in East Nashville. Like it's hard to find someone who does great flooring, and not because they don't exist, but because they're so busy, right? There's such demand. And so like I would invest in that. I would give that person the money. I would help build their website. I would help direct them into ways to market their services and help them get that lumber. Like that would be a perfect fit for us because they're already generating revenue. Marketing could potentially, double their revenue. And the way that we make money is we do a simple rev share agreement. So it's a rev share where you pay us back our investment, and then we take a small percentage of your revenue in perpetuity. And so, it's for folks who need that extra boost, but also could use our knowledge. I can stand up a website, but also help you get the word out pretty simply. And so that's an example of like a business that would be interesting to us.
That's a super interesting concept. And I want to transition to what I call the selfish section. So this is where I ask a question specifically for me.
Sure.
So it's interesting. I was actually going to do this about something via LinkedIn, but I've changed my mind on the fly. You've talked about, your wife a few times during this podcast. You've talked about her during Thursday night sales, like, hey, I got to leave at this time because I got to go have dinner with my wife. Like every week that was consistent, right? And you've
Always.
mentioned that. You mention it like in your website, it's like, or LinkedIn, it's like, hey, these are some of my hobbies. And it always mentions her. So I would love to just understand from you as someone else that is, kind of peaking towards, I'm in a very serious relationship, peaking towards, engagement and marriage and things like that in the near future. Like, how do you do both those things? How do you go from being workaholic, Justin, that is, super meticulous and focused on your business and the finances and things like that, but also, creating what seems like on the outside a very, great relationship?
Yeah, it's a work in progress always. Like I think what you saw on Thursday night sales is probably a good example of that, right? Like I love Scott and Amy, and they could go until 10 p.m., but that just I don't know. Like I work a lot during the day, and so to do that, I just didn't think was fair, right? So I used to cut out at I think 7 p.m. Every week, and that's just an agreement that we make, right? That's just you make an agreement and say like, hey, you work a lot during the day, and so evening is our time, right? I think another thing that we do is I know this may sound weird to some folks, but I'm a calendar junkie. So like everything that I do, both professionally and personally, exists in my calendar in a very color coded way. And so I know it sounds weird. I schedule like time aside from work, right? My wife and I like to walk. I have 2 back surgeries, so running is not real simple for me. So we do a lot of walking and hiking. And so I'll carve out time on Friday mornings, Monday mornings, like early to go to Shelby Park, which is around the corner from us, hence the Shelby Project, and do a 4-mile walk. We'll go to I'm blanking on the name. There's another park right now, about 30 minutes outside of Nashville. I think it's called Percy Warner Park. We'll go there on the weekends, and we'll do like a 2-hour hike, which is a little bit more challenging. And so we carve out time like that. She's pretty good at cracking the whip. If I'm like on my computer at 6 p.m., she'll be like, I'm not going to talk to you with that computer open. So, there's a lot of that. And so like, I'll shut the computer down and we'll pour a glass of wine and like spend some time together. We have dinner together every single night. There's a lot of times where we get to have lunch together, which is really cool, especially on Mondays and Fridays. So on Mondays and Fridays, we might go out to a really cool restaurant here in Nashville and have a great lunch. So it's really it's about making it a priority. I think that's, if you don't make it a priority, then it's going to fail. And so I have to be reminded of that all the time, and I'm certainly not perfect at it.
Yeah, I think that's great. And how do you go about the calendar? I do something similar, but how do you go about the color coding and like what's your strategy there?
Yeah. I like to be able to glance at my calendar very quickly and understand what my week is looks like. So it's like red for exercise, it's aqua for content creation, it's yellow for email, it's blue for meetings, it's green for money meetings. Like it's very simple for me to glance at my calendar very quickly. Gray is lunch, red, like pink is dinner. Like I have all these different colors I use, and I can glance at my calendar in a moment and know exactly how I'm spending my time that week. And it also helps me with that sort of system that I'm working on to try and free up my time, which is, what can I eliminate? So at a moment's notice, I can see things that aren't as important to me. what can I automate? So is there a system that I can put in place to make sure that I don't have to do this particular thing every single week manually? And then what can I delegate? Like, I don't have a VA, but oftentimes, like, I'll spend a lot of time tinkering with my website and then be like, gosh darn it, I can go on Fiverr and hire this person to figure this out. And so I've been doing a lot of that as well. And my color coding helps me stay focused on what's important and what's less important.
You ever look at that calendar at the end of the week and like, man, I spent way too much time doing A, B, or C. It's like, man, I don't have any green on here for money meetings. Like, what
Yeah.
happened this week?
Yeah. Now, the good thing is clients come first for me. So
Yeah,
it's,
okay.
I'll call that the foundation of my house, and everything else is built around it. So I do look at that though. Like, I'll give you an example, which is a real life example. I'd like to transition into having a personal website where I'm blogging more regularly. And there's a site called ghost.org, which you can stand up a really nice blog. And that's what I'd like my new personal site to be built on. But it requires some knowledge of coding. And so for 3 straight days, for like 2 hours in the morning, like 5:30 in the morning, I was like frantically trying to learn how to code. And like, that happens to me all the time. And then I had to take a step back and say, I think that someone probably already knows how to do this and can get this done very easily. So after wasting 5 or 6 hours of my time over 3 days, I went onto Fiverr. I paid a guy in Nicaragua $30, and in 1 hour, he had it completed. And I was like, this was such a time saver. He was really super pumped to get the job. I was super pumped to get it taken care of, and it cost me $30. And those are constant reminders to myself of, how I should be spending my time.
Yeah, I think that's great. And before we transition out, I did want to get one question that I sourced from the audience from my guy Brian Marzo. So he asked me, managing time specifically for, all right, so he's in a role where he is leading a team, driving that new business, and managing clients, and doing all those three things at the same time. And I think has really struggled with time management. I can relate from my last role, was a player coach, and so leading a team, and also had a quota to cover as a rep. And it wasn't impossible, but it was really challenging to manage my time as well. So what would you recommend to someone that maybe has multiple roles within their own role and are really struggling to prioritize and find the right ways to use their time?
I mean, I would use the system that I use, and it is a system from a guy named Rory Vaden, who ironically is here locally in Nashville. And I stumbled across his TED Talk a few months ago, and it really struck a chord with me. And it's what it is essentially that procrastination is not a bad thing. And so when I read that, I was like, that can't be true, right? So I watched the TED Talk, and here's his system. He's got essentially a funnel where each morning he looks at his calendar and the things that he has to do. And the first thing he asks himself is, which of these things can I absolutely eliminate? Like, what is something that's on my calendar that like I did as a favor, but like definitely isn't adding to my bottom line, especially because I'm super busy. Like in this example of Brian, right? He doesn't have time to do people favors because he's super busy. Like, what can I eliminate first, right? Next, what can I automate? So oftentimes when I'm talking with sales leaders who have multiple responsibilities, I'll dig in and find that like forecasting takes an hour because they're doing it in an Excel document. It's like, okay, if you're doing an hour's worth of forecasting every week, you're spending 52 hours a year forecasting, right? Could you take 10 hours and go find someone who can build something in your Salesforce instance or whatever instance you use, or use Zapier to create automated forecasting from your team that they fill out for you so that you don't have to worry about it? Could you save an hour a week? So it's what can you eliminate, and then what can you automate? What can you automate with software? What can you automate with Zapier? What can you automate with somebody who does it for you that you might hire, like a virtual assistant? And then what can you outsource? So like today, outsourcing, what you might think of Fiverr or Upwork, but maybe in his case, like outsourcing is whom on his team could he outsource some responsibility to, right? Who could he delegate some responsibility to? And once you've gone through those 3 exercises, what can you eliminate? What can you automate? What can you delegate? What's left is what you get to do, right? So there are 2 things that you can do with what you get to do. You can do it now, or you can do it later. What you should do now are the things that are most important, the things that have the highest impact to your day, to your week, to your month, to your quarter, right? Everything that you should do later, you toss into the top of the funnel again tomorrow, and it moves its way through. Eliminate, automate, delegate. At some point, the thing that you should do later will become the thing that you should do now, or it may get eliminated, automated, or delegated. So that is the structure that I now follow to manage my time more effectively. And I thank Rory Vaden in his excellent TED Talk for that.
Wow. Shout out to Rory. Brian, get to work on that calendar. Justin, where can we best find, but well, before we get to that, I got it. I don't know if you're a big self-promotion guy, but I have to promote maybe for you on your behalf that your content on LinkedIn is outstanding. The advice you give is fantastic. And what I appreciate is that you write like you talk. You say you like to write. And I like that you're not just writing to write, like you write the way that you talk. If people listen to this conversation and then they read your posts, they say the same guy did both of those two things, right? And I think that that's something that you don't always see. Salespeople aren't always the best writers. And so I appreciate that. And it's helped me on my journey. So I wanted to give a shout out to you for your LinkedIn, the LinkedIn Playbook. I've seen like hundreds of people post about it on LinkedIn. So, it's just, you're doing a lot of good in this general sales and revenue community. So I wanted to give you that plug, just in case you weren't going to plug yourself, but where else can people find you? What's the best way to connect with you?
Sure. If they're interested in LinkedIn, they can go to the LinkedInplaybook.com. That's the LinkedInplaybook.com. If they just want to learn more about, me and some of the businesses that I have, they can go to theofficialjustin.com. That's theofficialjustin.com. And, if they want to reach out and say hello, they can email me at hello@theofficialjustin.com.
How cool of a site is The Official Justin?
It's corny, but it's easy to remember.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Well, I appreciate your time. Everyone go give him a follow on some of those platforms. And we'll be back next week with another episode.
Tom, thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, thanks.